there, internet. So it's a bit rainy outside and there's not much point in going out there to do archery. So what I thought I'd do is do a video for you guys, and I thought what would be good this time of year? Well, Christmas is coming, so maybe talk about products, so it's a good shout. What else? Well, it's a hunting season, I know, over stateside, and I know that it's indoor season coming up in UK and Europe. So I thought it'd be good to do a little video about arrows, because it's an important part of archery that sometimes is really overlooked because we all love bows so much. So I thought we'd do a little bit about that, just so I can explain my thoughts on arrows and what to think about if you're going to buy or make your own. So basically you've got three types of arrows. You've got wood arrows, aluminium or aluminum arrows, and carbon arrows. Each of these types of arrow has different strengths and different weaknesses, in my opinion. Now, these might just be opinions, they might be a little bit more than that, but I think we'll talk about them anyway, and you guys can leave me comments on what you think about this. So, going through the three types, the first type I have here is a wooden arrow. So, things I like about wood arrows: they're traditional. You feel like Robin Hood shooting them. They're very much a callback to our ancestors and walking through history shoots. I like them because they're pretty. You got the grain running through it, you got all those really nice feathers that you can put on, you get some really nice traditional points you can put on. Other thing I like about it, you can make them yourself. I find wood arrows are fairly easy to make yourself. You can also make aluminium and carbon arrows, but they tend to be a little trickier. Wood arrows is a great way to start getting into arrow building though, and at a low price usually for wood arrows. It's not so bad if you muck up, or it's not so bad if you break one. Bad things about them: it's a natural compound, it's wood. Problem with that is that it's not the hardest of materials for a start. Your steel points are gonna damage your wooden shafts quite irreversibly usually, so there is always that issue there. But then again, that's offset a little bit by the low cost. Another thing is, because it's a bit of wood, it's an individual piece of a tree, every single wooden arrow is going to be slightly different. Probably, and sometimes they can be quite a bit different. So this gives a little bit of issue with spining, which is how much the arrows bend. We'll talk a little bit more about spining and Archer's paradox in a bit. But it's quite difficult to get a set of really close matching wooden arrows. It takes a certain amount of skill in being able to spot and test them, and also a bit of luck, really, to be honest. So that's the downside of it. Another downside, I think, is how they get affected by age. Steel and carbon arrows are more affected by use. Wood arrows are affected by use and, I'd say, age. A set of wooden arrows that is left for a good few years, we're talking years I guess, but they will stiffen slightly, I find, and you do tend to get a little less forgiveness from a wooden arrow. Another thing with wooden arrows that people have said to me, is this true, which yeah, fairly, is that you can always straighten a bent shaft a little bit. As long as it's not broken, you can work it a little bit in the field. Problem with that is, as you work a bent shaft with a wooden arrow, you're going to weaken it because you're moving those fibres around. So they're good, they're cheap, they're a nice entry level, they're certainly traditional, they've got a quite nice feel when you're shooting them, but the problem here is consistency. The problem here is almost reliability and durability. So again, not a bad arrow, not a bad start. Next we have aluminium or aluminum arrows. These are Easton 2016s. These are my regular go-to arrows. I've used these now. These have got to be not far off a year, 2 years old. Aluminium, obviously metal. Again, it has its advantages and disadvantages. Advantages: it's value for money. It's a good, tough arrow, and they're not overly expensive. I mean, you can pick up and get a complete arrow in the UK for about £8, so I'm not sure the equivalence of that in America, but it's not too bad. You guys will probably get cheaper because most of the arrows are actually made in the USA. But yeah, it's a real good value for money, and that's quite handy. Another thing I like is, unlike carbons and really wooden arrows, you can buy one at a time. Most shops, especially around here, will sell you an individual aluminium arrow, which is great for beginners who are starting off with something like sighted, or people that aren't too keen on wooden arrows who want to go straight to aluminium. It's really good because if you're like me, you're not exactly flush in the pocket. Rather than buy maybe a set of 6 or 12 of these, you can just buy 3, or even, I mean, I'd say 1, but I advise 3. That's a great start for anyone who's maybe not sure about whether archery is going to be for them, but certainly wants to give it a go. 3 of these, that's, you know, for as little as £15 maybe, and you've got a starting set of arrows there, which is, it's handy, isn't it? It's a good idea. Other things about aluminium, you can get all different shafts, you can get all different colour feathers, you can get all different nocks and points. A little bit of variation, depending on what you want to do. If you're hunting, obviously you can have broadhead points on here. If you use them like I do for training and competition, you can just have a simple competition point. It's quite a versatile arrow. Other good things, because they're manufactured, you can get spine ranges, so they'll always be within a tolerance allowed for that arrow. Well, that means that you've got another consistent thing to your archery, something else that you know is going to be right. It narrows down that spectrum of errors, of variation in your shot. So that's quite handy. You can shoot the first arrow and the second arrow knowing that they're both the same, knowing that it's not like wood, that it could be your arrows that are different that might throw out your shots. It's quite handy. It's quite handy. Bad things about aluminium arrows. Once you bent an aluminium arrow, you tend to find that it stays bent. You can get straighteners, you can straighten them, but what you get is weakness in that area. Sort of like we spoke about with the wooden arrows, you get a serious weakening then, which it's never quite the same again. It always bends slightly there, and you tend to be constantly trying to readjust that bent area. Same thing I find, no matter how much flash things, no matter what colour feathers you put on them, no matter what you do, they always look a little bit boring. I mean, I got quite boring colours here anyway. I do like the black and grey look, and I get quite a few compliments on it. But you do get, it's a little bit boring. And another issue is feathers to aluminium shafts tends to be a bit of a pain to get the glue to set. You really need to take your time and really let it bond, which and they do tend to come off easier, which is always a bit of a downside. Veins on the other hand tend to be a bit better, but yeah, feathers never quite so great on an aluminium shaft. So, flip on my nose page here because I've written a couple of things about my newest, I guess, addition to the family. These arrows, which were kindly donated by Ed, I can't pronounce your name, is it Kako? Who's lives in Massachusetts, asked me how come I didn't shoot carbons. And I explained to him obviously that money situation is hardly great, and you know, I shot what I could afford. I'm really a poor man's archer in a way. I just make the most of what I can. And he offered very kindly to send me these, which are Eastern Trad carbons, which is, well, I mean, I'm over the moon. They're an absolutely beautiful arrow, and again, Ed, thanks, and I'll drop a link to his page here so you guys can see what Ed's up to. But yeah, real nice guy, and I truly appreciate it. So I've had a couple of shoots with this. I had to do a bit of modifications, which I'll speak about in another video, or later on in this one maybe. And eventually I got this correct to my bow. So, carbons. What's good about carbons? Carbons are tough. Carbons can take an absolute battering. Carbon fibre, as we all know, is one of the strongest materials that we're actually using right now, as well as being one of the lightest. And that's your second point. These are strong and these are light. They really are. What else is good about carbons? Consistency. these are high grade arrows, these are competition top end arrows, these are hunting top end arrows. You're going to really get what you're paying for, and consistency with these, the tolerances that they use really are great. Another little thing I like is that feathers are much easier to glue onto carbons because you get that grain that runs through the carbon. If any of you use carbons, you can literally feel it under nail. It's tough, gritty grain, and the glue really loves it, and the feathers really like it as well. They can really get a nice glue onto it. What's bad about them? Not much. Not much is bad about carbon arrows, apart from the one thing: price. Now, carbon arrows really do hit you where it hurts, right in the pocket. You're gonna struggle, especially as a beginner. You don't want to be going out and getting carbons, because if you break a carbon, you're gonna cry, because they really are that much more expensive. You're paying what you get, and the pay is high. It's a beautiful, horrible thing, but yeah, carbon arrows definitely my favourite arrow that I've shot. Definitely the most expensive arrow that I own. So that's them. So we've talked a little bit about arrows and what their sort of like characteristics are. What about what's important when picking an arrow? Well, there's sort of 3 or 4 things that you need to think about when buying arrows. The best thing I can advise you to do is, if there's an archery shop near you, go and speak to them, because they would have been doing this day in, day out for years. They'll know exactly what you need, what you don't need, what to ask you, what to measure, and they'll sort it all out for you. I always do it. I very rarely try and sort myself out, only because it can get a bit overwhelming, and especially with more expensive arrows like carbons, it's not worth you making a little cock up and really hitting yourself in the pocket. So, things to think about if you were buying or making your own arrows. First thing, length. Arrow length. Now, an arrow is going to be different lengths depending on things like your draw length. You can't have a 12-inch arrow because no one has a 12-inch draw length, apart from maybe children. But you're going to have the usual draw length is 28. Some people have draw lengths of 32, so they're obviously going to need longer arrows. So that's an important factor. Secondly is draw weight of your bow, or poundage. Arrows need to fly. When an arrow flies, it oscillates at 2 points, about here and here. Thanks, Ed, again, you've helped me with this. Because of that oscillation, you need a certain thickness of your arrow shaft. Your bow weight will say how much force is pushed on it, and therefore how much the arrow is going to bend. The more force you're pushing on it, the stronger you're going to need your arrow to be to resist that initial force. So when the first bend comes, it doesn't snap your arrow. Or you need to make sure that if your bow's weaker, when the first bend comes, your arrow is thin enough that it can actually bend. Otherwise it'll just go out straight, and that'll throw off your shot, especially shooting traditional where arrows need to bend around the handle of your bow. Okay? And the third thing, as I said before, was spine. Now, spine sort of refers to how thick your shaft is, or how dense the material used in your shaft is. There's all different sizes. To sort of demonstrate this, I've got 2 arrows. I've got my aluminium arrows that I use for my 50-pound bow, which are 2016 Eastern arrows. And you could really put some force into it to bend it, and they don't bend. However, we do have another arrow here from a 20-pound bow. Okay? Again, Eastern jazz this time, but with very little pressure, 2 fingers pressure, you can bend them. If you look, you can see the difference between a 50-pound shaft and a 20-pound shaft. You can literally see that my shaft is almost literally double the size of the 20-pound one. So actually the size of the shaft and the spine of it, how easy it bends, is really important. The 2 sort of key things to think about, dog. The 2 key things to think about is that the longer your arrow is, the easier it is to bend usually. Think about bending an arrow like this, and then think about bending something like a pen or a pencil. It's much harder to bend something that's shorter, because you don't have that force that you can put into with something longer. You haven't got the area that you can bend. The second thing is, going back to this, thinner is weaker. Thinner arrows bend easier. Imagine bending, again, this arrow or a tree trunk. It's much easier to bend the arrow because it's that much thinner. Finally, this bit I talked about earlier on, the archer's paradox, that bending around the handle, bending around the bow, is really important. That's where you're going to get your shots being thrown off by having an arrow that's too weak or too thick. And I know this because I accidentally made arrows that were a much higher spine than were required for my original longbow. And my shots are being thrown off everywhere. Very specifically, I think it was to the right of the target, because they went bending around the bow right before starting to swim towards the target. So you need to think about that. That's why this bit's important, okay? So other things we can talk about on bows, archery, arrows. Feathers versus vanes is another question that comes up quite a lot. Why would I use feathers? Why would I use vanes? I use feathers. The reason I use feather is that I always shoot off the shelf when I'm doing archery. That allows me to shoot off the shelf, and as the arrow passes, if you can see, the feathers bend out of the way quite easily. That means that my shot's not being thrown off when I'm shooting. However, if you're shooting in a club, if you're shooting something like a compound, or if you're shooting a recurve sighted bow, they tend to shoot off arrow shells, which are much thinner, much more pliable, they move on their own, and therefore when they shoot they use vanes, because you can have smaller vanes, they don't damage as easier, they stabilise it fairly well, and they're not going to be affected by the fact you're using an arrow rest, but they would be affected if you were using a shelf. The reason for this is, if you imagine this was solid rather than pliable feathers like it is, when you shoot your arrow, it goes and it'll rise up. And you can imagine that if you can literally see how much that affects the arrow there. That'll at least put a little bit of vibration into the arrow as it comes off. At worst, it can completely throw off your shot. It's not great to use vanes if you're shooting off shelf. Other things, well, feathers are quite important. I talk about feathers because it's what I'm used to, but again, you can have different feathers. These ones that are off the 20-pound bows arrows, off the Eastern Jazzes, are small feathers. These that are off my war bow arrows are quite big feathers. Okay, you've got 2-inch feathers versus what's probably 7-inch feathers there, 6-inch feathers. Bigger feathers cause more drag. If you're shooting a really big feathered arrow, then it's the equivalent of having a parachute out the back of a plane or something. So if you imagine that a plane's swirling down and you open a parachute, it slows it down from the back point, and that's what happens. This is travelling forward and the feathers cause drag. What drag basically does is pull the arrow back, almost like you're trying to straighten a piece of string. So it goes from being wavy to slowing it down and stabilising it. The more drag, the quicker that can happen. So that's when arrows like flu-flus have massive, massive feathers on the back. So it causes so much drag that as soon as they're at the bow, they're starting to stabilise. However, more drag also causes your arrow to slow down quicker. It's got more air resistance there, slowing it down. That's why you never see anyone shooting clout with flu-flus, because flu-flus have a much, much shorter range because of that drag. It's the equivalent of throwing a paper aeroplane or throwing a paper aeroplane with a parachute. You're not going to get the distance because as soon as you let go, there's something pulling it back. There's an opposing force there. Okay? So, slow, stable arrows, bigger feathers. Quick, less stable, longer reaching arrows, small feathers. Another thing that, again, I've had with these carbon arrows that I think's quite a good idea, and I've never really encountered them myself, is arrow wraps. In which case, you wrap your arrow in plastic, and I think you quite literally can get a piece of paper where you glue your feathers on beforehand. Then what you do is roll them up as I guess you would a cigarette, and you get almost perfect feathers. These ones are even barreled, so I'll show you a close-up later on, but the feathers actually curl around, which gives it more spin. which means you're going to again get more stability. That's what causes stability, is that spinning motion of your feathers and vanes to really sort of the way a gun's barreled, so that the bullet spins and it gets tighter grouping rather than flittering through the air. It cuts through the air better. Other things to think about. Points. Now I've got 4 different arrows here with 4 different points. As you can see, the bigger points are going to be heavier, especially as well as denser. I mean, denser points are going to be heavier. Now, points, and I find this quite hard to explain, but points really affect your arrow as well. You want a point that's suitable for your arrow. Think of the way that if you put a big basketball on the end of this arrow, it's really going to affect the way the arrow flies. And it's kind of similar. If you've got a weight on it, it's like maybe throwing a mace around, or a baseball. You've got weight at the end, and that weight can really affect the way that your arrow oscillates. So it's important, again, to get an arrow point that's weighted correctly for your arrow. Just something else to think about. Points as well, we can talk a little bit about different types of points. So I've got basically 3 types of point here. I've got a competition point on my aluminium arrow. I've got a sort of bodkin point, a medieval style point on my war arrow. I have screw-in points on my carbon arrows, which are really handy, especially for you Americans who maybe do go hunting. You can use a screw-in point like this for competition or practice, and then you can screw in a broadhead ready for when you are going out hunting. Again, you have broadhead points, which are made for cutting, made for use in hunting or demonstration, but really aren't that good for use on a target, because they'll wreck your target straight away. Okay, so there's lots of different things you can think about. Also, with your medieval points, you've got very sort of different types of points there, and I quite like looking at the different points and using different points and the sounds different points make, etc. Finally, nocks, which is the last thing I'm going to talk about. So your nocks are the back end of your arrow. Now, this medieval arrow has horn nocks, which is basically an insert of horn into a cut shaft to make sure that the shaft doesn't split. It's a very traditional way of doing it, and it's very nice, again very pretty. Maybe not the most stable, but very pretty. But nowadays you can get plastic nocks, and there's different types of plastic nocks. A little tip for you guys: if you do buy nocks that don't fit your string, best thing to do is soak your nocks in hot water, boiling hot water, pour it in a cup, dunk it in and soak it for a little bit, take it out, put it on your string, and then leave it to cool. And that can sometimes really help just widen those nocks without having to file or damage them. It's a little tip there for you guys that I tend to find works quite well. That's really all I've got to say about arrows. By all means, put some comments and some questions on this video, and I'll get back to them as soon as I will. But from, again, a poor man's point of view, here's my advice. Start off with your wood arrows. Maybe don't start making them yourself, but if you can find a friend or someone in your club who knows how to make wooden arrows, ask their advice. Buy the equipment, get yourself set up. Wood arrows are much easier to maintain and carry on using. Then save up a little bit. Get your odd individual aluminium arrows. You don't have to buy loads of them, buy 1 or 2. You know? Build up a little bit of a collection when you can. Finally, when Christmas comes, save. Get yourself a set of traditionals eventually, but make sure that you know what you're doing by that point, that you've shot for a couple of years. Don't waste your money on something like carbon arrows if you're not sure you're going to keep up the sport. So that's all I really have to say about it. I hope this video has been helpful. By all means, leave some comments and shoot straight, guys, and I'll see you later. Thanks.
Darling, you're with me